Businesses are always incentivized to standardize. And there's a real fear, of course, that both in terms of language, ideas, research, that AI tools, they're becoming more and more homogenous. So there's a real fear now also with what is called generative inbreeding. So basically AI systems feeding themselves with content that is synthetically produced for the first time. So it's this sort of insularity now of systems. I think that's very concerning, that might inevitably lead to a more homogeneous world and a very monochromatic society. It's hard to see how that will not happen. But I think what we can do is to rein it in, or at least sort of ring fence it and delegate that kind of homogeneity to those aspects of business that are purely focused on optimization and efficiency, and protect those spaces in business and in life where, in fact, heterogeneous thinking and diverse thinking are still crucial.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. This podcast explores and discusses the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm joined today by my usual co-host, Shruti Prakash. Hello, Shruti.
Hello, everybody.
We are thrilled to welcome a guest who has profoundly influenced my thinking over the years, I must say. He's a visionary author, an entrepreneur, thought leader, who has redefined how we see intersection of business, creativity, and human values. Tim Leberecht. Tim is the co-founder and co-CEO of the House of Beautiful Business, a global platform that brings together leaders, thinkers, and creators in reimagining the future of business as a force for beauty, humanity, and connection. He is the author of, I would say, a groundbreaking book, The Business Romantic, where he explored how businesses can transcend transactional relationships to essentially foster more meaningful experiences and genuine connections between companies, customers, markets, and society. Before founding the House of Beautiful Business, Tim, among many other things, also served as a chief marketing officer of Frog Design, where he led brand and marketing strategy for one of the most influential design firms in the world. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Simon. Hi, Shruti. Great to be on the podcast.
I've been following your work, Tim, for a few years now, as you can imagine, and I've quoted you countless times on slides and talks. I would say our connection goes way back, probably more than a decade. I was catching up yesterday, but essentially, when I had the privilege of having you speak at the Wisher Fest, I was coordinating the program. Wisher Fest was looking into this collaborative and sharing economy more than 10 years ago. And I think you were working on the ideas that then led you to the Business Romantic book. So your work has always challenged conventional narratives about business. You have been emphasizing beauty and meaning, which are words that normally don't really fit into business talk. And in today's world, where not only efficiency and scale often dominate the narrative, but also in a world where we face converging crises, from climate change to social polarization, or wars, actually, unfortunately. And simultaneously, we're dealing with kind of technological revolutions with AI. So my question for you, how do you see the role of your work, essentially beauty and humanity, into the current situation, which doesn't really cater to at least, and normally one wouldn't think that it caters to thinking about beauty. So how's your work fitting into these new realities?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy that, that you referenced that. I'm very humbled that you referenced some of my work on your slide, Simon. And I've also been a long time admirer of your work. And I remember very fondly our last meeting in Rome. Yeah. So how does beauty, speaking of Rome and the great beauty of it, how does beauty fit into this world that we're facing today, a world of the poly crisis and in many ways, right, the agony of systems that at least I and my generation have really grown up with and have sort of taken for granted for the most part. I would argue that beauty is more important than ever. So I actually feel very vindicated and reinvigorated by what is happening, and kind of confronted with a spirit of like, yes, what I've been doing, what I've been trying to promote and advocate is more urgent and more important than ever. So it's almost like from a, I don't know, intellectual passion of mine, it's now become a political project. And that isn't kind of uncomfortable a little bit, but also probably the only possible response. Specifically speaking, I actually am also an American citizen, and I'm a German citizen, an American citizen. And I was actually in the US, in Georgia, in the swing state of Georgia, to vote on November 5th in this election. And I woke up like many other Americans, at least, 50%, just in utter disbelief, that of this in the face of this paradox that on the one hand, we're developing AI and the advances in engineering and science are just, incredible. And at the same time, here we are going back to this nostalgic brand of nationalism, right? That kind of renders any liberal notions of progress obsolete, or at least spits them in the face. So that's one reality. And then I went to Dubai, to the Dubai Future Forum, and attended that for the first time, which, billed as the world's largest gathering of futurists, at least gave me hope in the fact that there are some people still, professions and practices, working on the future, and with the belief that we humans can actually actively design the future. And then after that, I went to Venice and I attended the Planetary Summit hosted by the Berggruen Institute, a think tank founded by Nicholas Berggruen. First of all, it's really remarkable to be in the heart of good old Europe and in this absolutely fascinating city of Venice. But then, in a way, think about and explore a whole new paradigm for doing business, which goes beyond a human-centered notion of it and embraces more, life centricity and a more than human area that is shaped by artificial intelligence, but also a renaissance or a reconnection with nature and biology, and maybe even extraterrestrial outer space visions of the future. So just to give you an example of like, this has been my past 3 weeks in a way. So I was in good old Europe, an interesting blend between past and a very daring future. I was in the UAE, in Dubai, where I feel like the vision of the future is somewhat technocratic and linear, right? That very sort of strong belief in like, okay, with the right resources and planning, we can create a very human future. And I was in the US, which in a way is like a future of the past, right? It's kind of like, this is the future we certainly do not want. And the pendulum has so swung back. And like everybody else, I'm really struggling to make sense of it all. And this paradox of, on the one hand, like a new consciousness and incredible advances in engineering and science and our understanding of the world. And on the other hand, these retrograde brands of politics and the social divisions, and also this very archaic, raw human nature that we now see, in violent conflicts and wars in Europe, is so shocking. So how does the House of Beautiful Business, how does beauty fit into this? So we've always, and we've been around for 7 years, we've always tried to be a bridge between different ideas. We've always tried to challenge the notion of sort of mainstream thinking and really simply create space for other ideas. Other ideas maybe that often are ridiculed or laughed at by middle of the road business people who say it's dreamy or it's too idealistic or it's romantic and whatnot. But I feel like that there's a connection between the hardening of our political discourse, the hardening of our societies, the hardening of our workplace culture, and at the same time, a denial or a neglection of soft skills and a softer debate and tenderness and warmth and spirituality and not knowing and uncertainty and all these things, right, that are a bit fuzzy. And I think what we're trying to do, and where maybe our impact can be, is to create a counterweight to those who believe they own the truth and think in binaries and think everything is measurable and absolute, And I think we are trying to do that through experiences more so than anything else, by bringing people into the same room and create experiences that are emotional, that go under their skin. And this is something I was reminded of in Dubai, where we hosted a dinner that was called the Hopeful Dinner. At the end of the day, the very least we can do with the way we gather and what we are thinking is to generate hope. That there is another truth out there, that this is not all there is, that another future is possible. Anyway, long answer to your question. You see, I'm quite agitated about this because I think I'm in shock a bit about what I'm seeing.
Who isn't? You wrap it up quite efficiently, let's say, the situation we live. I was trying to catch some notes, and you said on one side we have an hardening of our work culture, the market, society, and on the other side we are in denial of potentially new skills or new capabilities that we should be picking from. Also, I think because they don't fit the usual narratives, right? So since these things don't fit the usual narrative, we really don't know how to use them in a business landscape. I think it's normal that companies or organizations or institutions or even people refrain from picking their emotional side or their beauty or creativity elements because they really don't speak the language of the expectations that exist for them. You also said another interesting thing, which is this is a political project, and I think this is very interesting because if you think about organizational culture so far, I think most of us and most of the leading narrative on the market has tried to consider business as something completely unpolitical and completely like, how can I say, logic. And so there was no space to think about business in different ways. There was only one business narrative and so on. So you have been talking to so many brands and organizations. So besides the initial shock and maybe also enthusiasm for seeing new possibilities as a business leader, what have you seen in them business leaders embrace in terms of how they have been trying to change their organizations in terms of practices or structures or new relationships? So I don't want you to go very deep, of course, because we're just at the start of the conversation. But if you can give us like a compass and say, when a business an organization embrace these new paradigms, what are the key spaces of actions and agency that they have in changing their structure or changing their culture or changing their skills or hiring policies or whatever, what they can enact actually on their organizations?
I'm definitely observing this pattern of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes even 3 steps back. I think if you work in an organization or if you've had a corporate career like I had, and for example, when I was wearing the chief marketing officer hat, so many things repeat themselves, right? So you go through these cycles where you come in with a change mandate, you change the positioning, you bring in different stakeholders, you relaunch the website, you relaunch the brand identity, you relaunch your go-to-market platform, you operationalize differently. You do this for 2-3 years, you've burned through all your political capital, and then basically you leave and they bring in someone else, or you do it again, which is even more frustrating. You go through the same cycle again, you renew everything, maybe incrementally. Overall, arguably, the organization will be better positioned in an ever evolving market and environment, but who knows? I think this sort of micro view of a profession or my tenure experience is also reflected in the broader trajectory of organizations. I feel like having observed this now for like 2 decades or so, there's always this change impetus, and there's times when change is welcome, and there are a lot of new paradigms forcing change or inspiring change. But then there's a moment of crisis when realpolitik and kicks back in, and pragmatism prevails over any form of sort of visionary thinking or the kind of thinking that really aims at changes meant to, yeah, really, I think, create a new reality long term. And I think that's the frustration, I think, and also the challenge that so many organizations face, right? So they have different leaders, the leaders change, they're kind of going in circles, right? They're changing, then they're changing back, they're stepping back, they're going back to the status ante quo, they're changing again. So overall, it often feels like a sort of zero-sum game. And I feel like that's pretty evident right now, because the biggest changes, since you've asked me about like what are some of the areas that I've seen, probably like many other people as well, are, I'd say mostly in the, before we even talk about AI and technology, but I think are mostly in the cultural realm. So I think we've seen a lot of social norms change over the past decade. Let's summarize them as, I think, change on sort of mainly, I would say, identity, gender, right? And equity and inclusion. But we're also seeing now this huge backlash against wokeness, quote unquote, DEI programs being cut, slashed, or not even mentioned anymore, right? It's kind of like people are really pulling back from that. At least many organizations are. What I'm seeing right now is also because you said organizations or businesses are trying very hard, or maybe many of them don't see themselves as political actors. I mean, it's far from true, obviously, I believe. I think, is there anything more political than a definition of what is valuable for us and how we create it? I mean, that is per se a political act. So any organization, any business, any value creation, any production, any distribution and organization of labor is, of course, inherently political. It reflects a certain worldview. It creates new politics. It's all about relationships between powers and how you design powers. So to ignore that and pretend that this is an agnostic, neutral space, I think that's just not true. And I'm actually quite appalled by also many of the progressive business leaders that I know, even people in our own community, who are now sort of saying, well, after the Trump election in particular, this was a democratic vote, arguably it was, but suddenly saying, well, we're a business, right? So 5 years ago, it was very hip to take a stance against structural racism and be woke and connect on values with the younger generation, and in fact many consumers. But now everybody is so timid and so afraid, and a lot of organizations, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and others have already kissed the ring, right, in Mar-a-Lago. And I think overall you see mainstream business being very, very, very reluctant to enact any form of political stewardship. So all that being said, I think the changes that organizations are open to right now, I mean, I think right now it's such a fork in the road moment. You alluded to that earlier, Simon. And this is the paradox, right? On the one hand, this is such an opportunity to shape a new paradigm, to really kind of rock the boat and really challenge the system of value creation and production and how we organize labor and what work actually is. And I think there's so many interesting initiatives on that, whether that is participatory design and co-ops and some of the work, of course, that you've been involved with. The if you will, the heirs of the witness, the sharing economy, right? The grandchildren of the sharing economy. There's so many interesting new models in terms of life-centered, regenerative production and leadership and all of that. And I think they're making their way into business mainstream. At the same time, I also see a strong sense of pragmatism, back to the basics, brass tacks. It's all about efficiency. It's all about surviving the next quarter, right? And I don't blame these businesses. These are really tough times in many economies. So of course, people are not necessarily in the mood for dreaming up and envisioning completely alternative versions of business. But I think it's this tension that's interesting. And maybe in that very tension, there is a path, forward that hopefully with our work, with your work, I suppose as well, we can design.
I've been listening. I'm such a big believer of this topic that I'm super passionate as well. One of the points that stood out from what you said is that it requires active designing and participation, right? It's not a passive, okay, it's happening by my side, okay, I'm merely a participant in the background. It's not that, it's sort of in the forefront. So, you spoke about some methods, that is, let's say, participatory design, co op, and things like that. But have there been any success points in sort of operationalizing these in organizations where organizations have actively participated in this process? I also know you spoke about resonance as a topic closely when it came to, let's say, roles in terms of storytelling, rituals that organizations can imbibe, and so on. So maybe to touch upon that a little bit would help.
If I can add just a little nuance to this, I was talking to Shruti, essentially she's asking for, to understand through examples. But what I can add also is I was wondering myself why beauty is so political. So why shouldn't all businesses seek for this type of transformations?
I'm not sure beauty is political, or you could argue what is political is who is to define what it is, right? I think, but I think beauty is something that's universally accepted, and that I think we all want. It means many different things for different people. And when I speak about beauty or with the House of Beautiful Business, we don't refer to this as a simply aesthetical phenomenon or cosmetics or decoration, right? Or something that's just harmonious. I think it's much more about something true. I think what is beautiful is what feels true and authentic, and what reveals something universally true about humans, where we feel like, oh, this is a moment, this is an experience, this is a relationship that reminds me of the best that we're capable of. Business in the workplace is an incredible force to uncover that, because that's where we spend the majority of our waking hours. That's where we still have relationships with people we probably cannot hand curate, right, and hand pick. So we're forced into social settings to some degree, even within those bubbles. So I think that's what I mean by beauty. It is controversial, or maybe not so easy to implement for businesses, because it is often considered an afterthought. It's not seen as something that's integral to the bottom line, right? It's something that we can afford in this sort of very narrow reductionist understanding of it. Once we are profitable, or once our business is thriving, then we can invest in culture and a more intimate culture and playfulness and joy. But beauty, I think it goes much deeper. Beauty means that your organization is aligned, that its values are aligned with the world around you, that you have the capability to leave a real, lasting, positive impact, a legacy of sorts, and that you touch people, and that you add value, moments, experience, products, services to this world, that other people experience as something that reminds them of the best of what humanity is capable of. Okay, this was a really long definition. So you were asking about examples, Shruti, of some of the things that have sunk into mainstream, or that have been successful transformations. So often they're invisible, because by the moment they've become mainstream, they feel old, or we have forgotten about them. One example that I was close to when I was still working at Frog Design is design thinking. Now everybody's laughing about it, and clearly has jumped the shark. People are saying, well, it was not good enough. It was great and lofty. And also most of the design firms that were touting it are now bought by Capgemini, McKinsey, and other big consulting juggernauts. But the influence it has had, reminding us of empathy and how important that is, really understanding not just functional consumer customer needs, but emotional, spiritual needs, thinking of design and in that sense also beauty as a real core ingredient of what people perceive as valuable. I think all those are accomplishments of design thinking. So I'm kind of the unlikely defendant of design thinking, even though I also at the time was very critical of this buzzword. But I think it has really changed the culture of organizations. The other big transformation that we've seen is that, and this goes in I believe in sort of pendulums maybe, but it's sort of the return of spirituality maybe, So the fact that airlines now, for example, ask their pilots to undergo yoga training, right? Or that mindfulness has been established at organizations at scale. SAP, at least that's the last I know, used to have a head of mindfulness. And, this is not laughed at. 15, 20 years ago, it would have been considered completely esoteric, completely woo-woo. We're now seeing conversations about energy. We are energy as a current of interaction as something that you need to actively manage as a leader in an organization. That is very hard to grasp and to quantify, but that's very, very important. Aura. We see CEOs and business leaders go to retreats where they foster their own mental well-being in order to be able to serve that of others. So those are all accomplishments and insights, I think, that would have been unimaginable maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I think they've slowly sunken in, and some of them will probably be spit out again by the system, as we're seeing now with DEI and others. But I think at the end of the day, though, the core of all these progressions will remain, and I think that's also important sometimes to remember, because we tend to be so cynical and then think, oh, this has jumped the shark, this is now over, there's a new thing. But I would still remind us of the fact that movements like design thinking, that they have had tremendous impact on the business culture, and it will remain even after the buzzword is gone.
I'm a design thinking, I guess, practitioner myself. And like one of our earlier podcasts, right? Like they were speaking about how AI is being integrated even within the practice of, let's say, design, market research, customer research, becoming, let's say, using synthetic users, things like that. So when the starting point within an organization is leveraged by tech or like enabled through tech, and AI models in itself are very homogenized understanding of our world, how do you create diversity in that human experience when your starting point is homogenized? So that's something that I'm always curious about. And like you said, right, like there are so many, like it's operating not in binaries anymore. So I'm just curious what you think about it in these regards.
Yeah, that's such a good question, Shruti. That is the question, isn't it? And I think here too we're seeing this tension. Businesses are always incentivized to standardize, so I think by design they lead towards homogeneity and standardization. And there's a real fear, of course, that both in terms of language, ideas, research, that AI tools, and there's been research, right, that showed that large-scale language models, LLMs, they're becoming more and more homogeneous, that they're actually converging in the reality that they're creating. So there's a real fear now also with what is called generative inbreeding. So basically AI systems feeding themselves with content that is synthetically produced for the first time, not by humans and digitized on the web. So it's this sort of insularity now of systems. I think that's very concerning, that might inevitably lead to a more homogeneous world and a very monochromatic society. So it's hard to see how that will not happen. But I think what we can do is to maybe rein it in, or at least sort of ring fence it and delegate that kind of homogeneity to those aspects of business that are purely focused on optimization and efficiency, and then draw a big line around it in the best possible way and protect those spaces in business and in life where human ingenuity and imagination, and where in fact heterogeneous thinking and diverse thinking are still crucial. Even though you could challenge that, because when it comes to art, when it comes to writing, it's actually quite astonishing, as you probably know better than I do, what AI systems are already capable of. And I also feel that it's a bit of a hubris, isn't it, to think that we humans, I mean, it's a very human-centered and biased view to think that we are sort of at the apex of diverse thinking and creativity, right? What we're seeing is a new digital species, right? And there are those who say, well, this is a product of human thinking, is something that it's a computation, right? Something we created, we can control it. It's essentially just mathematics. So there's nothing mysterious about it. I'm not one of them. I don't take this engineering approach. I think I'm more with the other camp, where philosophers and engineers much more inclined to say there is a new form of intelligence, even perhaps consciousness, sentience, that is emerging, and we have long lost the ability to understand it, at least outside of the tools that we have available. So I think it could go either way, right? We're facing maybe a more than human future that is incredibly diverse, just not in a way that we're able to grasp with our, instruments and our thinking. And it might not have a great place for us humans, but maybe that's also very nostalgic to think of that as a future that's desirable. I mean, of course, we humans want a very human-centered future, but we've not been around for a long time in the grand scheme of things. So maybe it's also a moment of humility where, we are designing a new world that is transcending us. And maybe that's also okay. And I think at the very least, what's exciting is, and my recent attendance at the Planetary Summit in Venice reminded me of that we are witnessing this, right? We're living in a time of this change where a new reality, a new world is being born, is given birth right in front of our eyes. And how much agency we have, I don't know, but it's exciting to be part of this, to live in this era. I take comfort in that.
I had an interesting bit when you said let's use technology and let's optimize and let's think in traditional business terms, efficiencies and so on, for whatever we have to scale and homogenize and standardize in the organization, which sounds to me very in line with our current organizational thinking that basically advises for creating shared services and shared infrastructures, and then enabling massive entrepreneurship on top, right? So, for example, now we're preaching for organizations to create these shared systems and then have micro entrepreneurial units that develop their own go-to-market and value propositions and so on. I feel like it's a way to, when you create these spaces for entrepreneurship, you transcend traditional conversations around maybe care, or how can I say, so basically you mix creating the space for someone to flourish also with some aspects of accountability and deeper liabilities. So essentially you can create your own space, your future, your value proposition, your piece of the organization, but you have to be accountable to that. You have to be liable to some extent. So you have to manage your own liabilities, which I think for me, it's really about understanding the organization as a complex thing. So something that doesn't win automatically on the market. It's not something you just go and then perform into a well-structured plan that always works. It doesn't work like that. And especially now, organization no more work like that, because we're no more into the last century where you kind of had much more planned economies. Wrapping this up, I think it's very interesting if you look at the organization as a complex thing, if you look at an organization as something that needs to flourish in diversity and beyond binaries. And actually, I think it's also a very feminist way of looking at organizations, right? Because feminism has always been about complexity and also entrepreneurship, actually, right? Do you see this also part of the message around beauty? So beauty comes with more autonomy, more entrepreneurship, more accountability, more liability. Also, the other piece of the picture, to really go beyond the traditional narratives of diversity and inclusion and wokeness, as you said, that are really showing their limits, I think, at the moment, as the world switches to much broader complexity.
That's very interesting that you say this with the feminism. I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, feminism has always been about complex thinking, complexity, right? People think about feminism as something that relates with humans, with the feminine, but it actually is much more about a complexity mindset, for me at least.
I'm totally with you. I think it's a philosophical domain and a philosophical movement, right? I believe that first of all has a built-in resistance to any form of patriarchal systems, any systems of violence, and I think force, inflicted force. And let's face it, right? Management is a system of violence, right? It is a system of violence because it's trying to essentially brutalize and make manageable and controllable something that is absolutely not. Nature, resources, biology, and I find that so interesting about feminist thinking, that it actually invites us in a business context as well to operate at the pace of life, to be much more in tune with seasonality, with sort of biological value creation, with ambiguity. Some of the things that you mentioned that are really anathema or really counter to this narrow mindset of often very masculine, and I don't mean man only, but masculine in a sense of qualities, form of management. And I think that's very interesting to think about decolonization and creating spaces for a different kind of relationship to nature and to each other is a very feminist way of thinking. And it's true that organizations that reposition themselves that way and create cultures that are more complex in that way, I hope, are better positioned to thrive in the coming era, and are more diverse, are more innovative.
Tim, have you seen these companies accepting also the liabilities and entrepreneurial side? So do you see this convergence between, looking at different futures together with taking your own responsibility to build it, essentially?
You mean at the organizational level?
At the organizational level. So when you push these narratives of beauty and complexity and diversity and post-binary thinking, do you see companies also ready to accept the, let's say, the difficult side of this picture, so that you have to be a more actively protagonist of building these futures?
No, I haven't.
Exactly.
I haven't. No, I mean, that's the truth. I mean, I think there's some interesting startups. There's always really pioneering thinkers. I think from what Emmanuel Faber tried at Danone, many years ago, to cooperatives in the Basque region. There's lots of interesting sparks, and there's the work of John Fullerton with the Capital Institute and regenerative economics. There's a lot of interesting thinking on degrowth and how that can be ironically institutionalized. But I haven't seen really a business, small and medium size, or a large corporation fully embrace it. I think everybody's tapping the toes into the water, but I haven't seen the willingness to really radically rethink the system, because most organizations, of course, let's face it, are still accountable for quarterly earnings. They're legally liable. They're accountable towards their shareholders. And I think in a time of really in immense economic pressure, many are very reluctant right now to even think about any of these alternative things. But, ironically, I mean, what is then also, again, interesting is to see that there's almost like this shadow governance of the crypto economy, of course, which I'm really not very knowledgeable about, but just from the few talks and conversations that I had, I mean, it's interesting that every year, right, it's like, oh, crypto is over, and, it was a huge fad, but there is a community there, and there's some really interesting structures in terms of governance that are transnational, that are far beyond traditional management thinking, and that are inclusive, transparent, accountable in many different ways. I think the problem I have with that paradigm is that, in a strange way, it is almost like the pinnacle of transactionalization, right? It's like this. It's sort of like making everything a transaction, which is also maybe then depriving our work and our relationships of any romantic mystery that I would insist on. But it's interesting to see that there is another world of value creation and of collaboration forming, right? So maybe that's the best example I can give you, or the most sort of forward thinking, or the most radical or counterpoint to more conventional business at this point.
No, but I think it's meaningful because, to some extent, the crypto side of the conversation on organizing is rooted on some ideas that are, I believe, central also to your thinking. So, for example, the idea of scarcity, the idea of limits, the idea of going beyond narratives of positive sum games that actually do not exist. So, I think from the conversation we had so far, I captured that thinking about beauty in business and thinking about the future of thinking organizations and businesses as, again, non-binary, post-managerial, post-industrial, needs to go beyond the traditional narrative of inclusion and making things just easy for people. It's really about, actually, on the other side, it's about decentralizing power to people. It's about making them responsible and accountable and supporting them in the process. But it's really about thinking about organizations in a new way that implies that we cannot control, we cannot plan, we should be really engaging with reality in a much more continuous and decentralized and open way, right? So you said something very interesting. In the current market, what we see increasingly is that managers maybe have promised results to the stakeholders or shareholders, I should say. They're not getting them, and as a knee-jerk reaction, they are reenacting top-down managerial practices, and that's not going to end well. And so I think your conversation around building business, it needs to engage with this issue honestly. Am I right?
I think that's really beautiful what you said. It's a reminder, I think, that we need to build beautiful organizations. I just had a conversation just before recording this with a friend who heralded the difference between power and force, and said, and maybe this is a good starting point for us, that also beautiful systems, they are powerful because they tap into a power that in a way is shared and is greater than themselves, that's transcendent. Whereas so much of the traditional management and traditional business systems are still based on force. So they're forcing us to do certain things, right? Through incentives or penalties, right? Or some form of accountability, but it's not necessarily through intrinsic motivation or the belief of belonging to something bigger. I'm thinking about what you said about making it easier for people versus making it harder for people. And it's funny that I can already see like the corporate middle manager scolding me for saying, oh my God, how can you recommend making things harder for our people, right? The world is hard enough. The economy is hard. We can It's hard enough to make enough money to pay the bills and paychecks. But there's something so true about what you said, that especially when times are hard and the reality is changing so fast. And in fact, we don't even know anymore what reality is because it's being fabricated for us in so many ways. To really engage with that and go to where it hurts and, do the hard things and have the hard conversations, rather than, I think, this tendency of organizations, in fact, any community, probably our own, the House of Beautiful Business as well, to then just kind of shut off, right? And retreat and say, okay, we know what we believe in. We know what's true. We know what works. Let's just stick with that, rather than risking doubt or really challenging yourself and challenging others in harder conversations. So yeah, it's just so hard to do it because it's, I think, not really human nature,
I'm a big believer of looking beyond binaries and so on. But especially now, like you said, right? Like, let's say there is thought about feminism, and then that itself has progressed so much over the years. And what was once accepted isn't anymore. So, when these kind of whatever is considered humane in itself is constantly changing, how do you deal with that complexity? And I know you wrote about like poly opportunity as a topic to tackle poly crisis. So, what does the future look like? What does being humane mean? And how does all of this sort of tie back into an organization where opinions are also hyper dynamic and the implementation cycle itself might be shorter?
I think as a House of Beautiful Business, because we are centered on beauty, we have the great advantage that beauty is not necessarily human made. It doesn't have to be humane even. It can also be something that is awe-inspiring and shocking, but it's not necessarily created by humans, which is something interesting to ponder, right? And I believe we obviously have, like, we're nearing the end of, or have already left, the Anthropocene. We are all, I believe, realizing now that humans are not at the center of the universe, that we need to coexist and live with other forms of intelligence, including artificial intelligence. That's what we mean by the life-centered economy, which is the container or the story that we believe in, and that we believe is a good container for exploring various other new forms of business. The poly opportunity is something that we created in response to the poly crisis. It was an event in New York, and the premise there was that to say, well, if there are mutually compounding crises, climate, mental health, loneliness, social division, geopolitical instability, and so forth, what if we flipped the script and we looked at some of the positive trends? Let's look at feminism and inclusive growth and blockchain and emotional diversity and so forth, and studied the connections between them and whether there are ways to actually then amplify the relationships or the mutual benefits between these powers. That was the premise of the poly opportunity. We did one event in New York that was very exploratory and very inspiring, more so actually than we had anticipated. And we are now in the process or we are launching a new initiative that is called the Poly Opportunity. The tagline is how everything is interrelated for the better and what it means for you. So we're really trying to study a plurality of realities. I call it the poly reality. So that there's not one objective truth. There are many truths. How can we hold that diversity of life, coexisting with artificial intelligence, co-designing with nature, regenerative leadership? These are all some tropes that I think we're going to explore. And we have identified 5 opportunity areas: regenerative economics, open curation, planetary citizenship, and extended consciousness. And we have then, in a way, intersected them with 10 what we call powers. They're essentially meta skills for this new economy. And they go from humility, we touched upon that earlier, to time, laughter, resilience. And some of them are maybe a bit more expected, others are less. And we're trying to now, over the course of 4 months, gather to explore this notion and practice it actually with a community of participants, and maybe create a new framework, new models, new templates to then take action. So it's a way of creating hope. It's a way of doing something tangible that might lead to some completely different insights and places, but it's a good starting point. We feel it's a good story. It's a good call for action, if you will.
I think it's worth that we underline some of the topics that emerged from this conversation, which really helped us to clarify what does it mean to embrace a new narrative around organizations and businesses. It comes with the full picture. Let's say you cannot just take the good sides; you also have to take the let's say the bad sides. I think this is very different from how the conversation about transforming organizations has been marginalized in the last couple of decades. Marginalized into something that doesn't count, like CSR, or maybe let's do this diversity training and we're done. That's not the point. The point is really to embracing complexity fully, deeply, in presence, opening up with to new possibilities for real, not to just play this kayfabe of with different. I think that's very interesting, and I really encourage people to check your the website of the House of Beauty Business. I know that there is a festival coming up in May next year, so really, people check it out and see how you want to join and engage in this conversation that Tim is hosting. I think that's very important. Tim, before we close, I would like to ask you if you want to share a couple of breadcrumbs for our listeners, and maybe if you want to announce anything that it's maybe interesting and important on your side.
Yeah, well, as you already said, I would love for you all to join the Poly opportunity, and it's going to be 4 in-person events on 4 continents: Berlin, New York, Tangier, Morocco, and Istanbul. An online program and smaller events as well. And there are many ways to take part, and it would be amazing to see a lot of people take part in this. In terms of breadcrumbs, I'm always so afraid of this question because I haven't had time to prepare, and I admire people who are just like, oh, I'm these 6 books, and I can maybe share what I'm reading right now. And I have actually been reading more. Now I'm afraid that you asked me for specific poems, which I don't remember. But I've been reading more poetry lately, love poems. Not particularly like one poet or one book, but I've just been a little bit more drawn. I share poems, and that's interesting. I think the poetry, in a way, because our times are so ambiguous, has so much to say and maybe has the better language. I just went to the Venice Art Biennale on the very last day in Venice and saw only 3 or 4 pavilions. And I was reminded of the fact that art is so powerful and that it's so hopeful to see art and what artists make of this world. That was interesting. So I think it's a great time. I've been to more exhibitions this past year than in many years before. It's a great time to see art and to read poetry and train that part of our brain and our mind and of our understanding. I'm also just reading Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus, which I really was reluctant to read, probably because there's this built-in bias against a best-selling author and one of these big ideas people. But it's damn good, and I think it has a lot of provocations, and it's well written and about information networks and our understanding of truth and truth-seeking. And it's a really, I think, brilliant, sharp book that I highly recommend. And the last thing I would say is what I recommend is it's travel. It's so important, I think, that we stay open and that we have novel experiences. So I love this experience of, I'm actually flying to Athens tomorrow, where I haven't been ever, just for a day. Wow. I really don't know the city at all. And there's nothing more exciting for me than going to a place that's completely new, where I'm actually not prepared and I'm a bit lost. So this reminds me of one of the principles of the House of Beautiful Business, get lost without losing. I think that's important, that we learn that, or that we don't neglect that. So those are my breadcrumbs.
That's great. It may be also opportunity to travel for one of your events this year, because if I'm not wrong, you mentioned New York, Venice, Istanbul, and Tangier. Which are good spots for people to travel, and maybe they can mix traveling with participating to one of your meetings. And also funny, you said beauty is truth, and then you ask people for enjoying more poetry. And yesterday I was looking at a quote that said, poetry is like truth, because people hate both. That's, I think, a good note to close the conversation. Thank you so much, Tim. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with us.
Very much so. Thank you so much.
Shruti, thank you for your questions as always.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Simone.
And for our listeners, remember, you go to www.boundaries.io/resources/podcast. You will find Tim's transcript, all the links to the breadcrumbs, and everything else about the podcast and Boundaryless. Until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.